I am the Swarm. Author, Quantum Wizard. Chapter 371, Reactions from All Sides. A heated discussion among the Reikan councillors carried on for quite some time. Eventually, one of them remembered the presence of the military leaders in the room and hurriedly asked, "Admiral Heaton, what is the military's perspective on this?" The room instantly fell silent. Over a dozen high-ranking military officers, all holding ranks of lieutenant general or higher, were in attendance. Since the Reikans had reached an accord with the Swarm, Admiral Heaton had stepped back from the front lines and temporarily returned to the home world to recuperate. His immense prestige naturally qualified him to participate in this meeting, where he also served as the military's spokesperson. Until now, they had remained silent. But upon being directly addressed, Admiral Heaton did not hesitate to respond. After taking a moment to think, he spoke slowly, "I believe doing nothing at all is the best course of action." "Why?" one councillor pressed, his tone sharp. "If we do nothing, won't it give the Daki and their backers the wrong impression?" Several councillors and generals exchanged glances, mentally debating whether they should find a pretext to grant this person a 7-day vacation. Admiral Heaton, however, showed no sign of taking offence at the councillor's rude tone. He continued speaking calmly. "Before taking action, you must first assess your own capabilities. Do you think the Swarm's massive space octopi are wandering back and forth between the star and Azumo star for no reason?" As the Reikans sank into thought, Heaton elaborated, "The territory between those two Swarm bases happens to include our domain. Every time they pass through, it's a show of force. Their intentions couldn't be clearer. They're telling us to live quietly and not meddle in things that don't concern us." Noticing a few younger councillors, officers, and advisors bristling with indignation, Heaton chuckled. "There's no need to feel insulted or humiliated. In fact, I see this as a friendly warning from the Swarm. Given our current strength, we're insignificant in the eyes of both the Swarm and this so-called Interstellar Technological Confederation. Neither of these behemoths will target us intentionally. The Daki Empire, on the other hand, is the one we should be cautious of." "What?" The Swarm still hasn't responded. Diallo exclaimed, his frustration mounting. It had been some time since the information broadcast, and his initial confidence was giving way to doubt and anxiety. He had expected the Swarm, even if they didn't agree immediately, to at least send a message seeking more details. Once communication was established, with his information advantage and the persuasive skills he had honed alongside his young consort, he was certain he could manipulate the Swarm as he wished. However, the Swarm seemed utterly uninterested in his broadcast. Their lack of response completely disrupted his train of thought, rendering his subsequent plans useless. "Your Highness, our supplies are running critically low. At the current rate of consumption, we can last no more than 3 months, Aslet reminded him, standing by his side. The loss of their supply ships had placed them in an extremely precarious position. "Has there been any response from the Reikans?" Diallo asked irritably, scratching his head in frustration. Aslet, fully aware of Diallo's temper, knew her response would only further provoke him. Still, she had no choice but to lightly shake her head. "You didn't mention our offer to them?" Diallo asked. "I did. I proposed trading carrier-based fighters, but the Reikans weren't interested. Later, I raised the stakes by offering data on improving the range and power of their energy cannons. The Reikans showed some interest but still refused to trade. Their stance is clear: it isn't worth offending the Swarm for such a small gain." Previously, the Reikans had graciously provided a shipment of food to the Daki fleet but subsequently cut off contact with Diallo's forces. When Diallo failed to freeload further supplies, he resorted to offering trade goods. Almost immediately, the Reikans resumed communication. But based on Aslet's report, the negotiations had not gone well. "Ha, a small gain. Greedy Reikans. Then what's their asking price?" Diallo's expression turned increasingly twisted. Since the Reikans had reopened communication, they clearly wanted to negotiate, but "They want our repulsion field," Aslet replied. "What? Outrageous. Preposterous. They dare demand the Daki Empire's most advanced technology for a measly shipment of food. Aren't they afraid we'll annihilate them?" Diallo erupted. His face cycled through confusion, shock, disbelief, and finally uncontrollable rage. He began shouting about reloading the Crimson Kiss and mobilizing his forces to destroy the Reikans while frantically scanning the room for something to vent his frustration on. Unfortunately, the warship they were on was a standard vessel, devoid of unnecessary decorations. Perhaps his flagship would have provided him with more options for destruction. Watching Diallo's increasingly erratic behavior, Aslit quietly took 2 steps back. However, this movement caught the attention of Diallo, who was teetering on the edge of reason. With a quick lunge, Diallo snatched the small handheld computer from Aslit's hands and slammed it to the ground in a fit of rage. The act of destruction provided him with some release. The computer skidded and bounced along the floor for over 10 meters before colliding with a metal bulkhead, only to ricochet and slide a few more meters. However, Daki military engineering proved its reliability. The device remained completely intact after coming to a stop. Seeing the computer unscathed, Diallo became even angrier. "Admiral Heaton, are we sure this course of action is okay?" President Milton asked uneasily. Placing himself in Diallo's shoes, Milton felt he wouldn't be able to tolerate the Riken's coercive demands either. "Rest assured, Mr. President," Admiral Heaton said confidently. "Hesitation leads to chaos. To avoid further entanglement with the Daki, it's better to propose a condition they can't possibly accept and shut them down once and for all." "But won't this risk provoking retaliation from the Daki Empire? Didn't you previously mention being cautious of the Daki civilization?" Milton asked. "Caution applies to the present," Heaton clarified. "Given their current fleet size, it's highly unlikely they could withstand both the swarm's forces and our defenses to launch an attack. However, we must remain vigilant against underhanded tactics, such as attempts to sow discord between us and the swarm. That's precisely why I suggested deliberately angering the Daki to offer the swarm a gesture of allegiance." "And what about potential retaliation?" Milton asked humbly. "That's a concern for the future," Heaton replied. "At the end of the day, we are currently vassals of the swarm, while the Daki are mere lackeys of the Interstellar Technological Confederation. The titles may differ, but the essence is the same. At this level, we can't participate directly in this larger game. If the swarm successfully joins the Confederation, we'll have their protection and won't need to worry about Daki reprisals. On the other hand, if negotiations fail and it leads to open war, the Daki positioned as the frontline civilization bordering swarm territory will either be destroyed or severely weakened. By then, they'll pose no threat to us. Even if the swarm fails spectacularly and can't fend off the Confederation, the battlefield will undoubtedly attract major powers. Aligning ourselves with one of them would put us in a far stronger position than the Daki, and their so-called revenge would no longer be a concern." Milton nodded, finding Admiral Heaton's reasoning highly persuasive. Time passed. While Diallo continued to fret over the escalating food crisis, and the Rikens maintained their passive strategy of inaction, the swarm received good news: the first intelligent entity crafted from a Daki spiritual entity had been successfully created. Chapter 372, G. The first Daki to be transformed wasn't anyone of importance, but after a successful case and a few rounds of verification to ensure reliability, the transformation process for high-ranking Daki military officers was added to the schedule. A few days later, the swarm obtained more precise intelligence. The Interstellar Technological Confederation was indeed real, and its described capabilities weren't far from the truth. The Confederation's initiator was a civilization called G, a remarkably ancient civilization with a history spanning at least several 100,000 years. What existed in this star region before the G civilization is no longer traceable. According to the historical accounts made public by the Interstellar Technological Confederation, the G were the earliest civilization to emerge in this star region. In their primitive era, they gave birth to a sage. The sage's name has been lost to the river of history, but their contributions were recorded. During that age of primitive tribes, when the G survived by crafting stone tools, hunting, and warring to subsist, the sage realized that the starry skies above were the future of their species. The sage quickly presented their vision to their tribal chief and gained support. Following this, they traveled across their home world, persuading all tribal leaders. In that era, before even the most basic beasts of burden had been domesticated, how the sage managed to traverse mountains and rivers and unite the entire planet is unrecorded. However, it is understandable. After all, every early civilization has its share of myths and primitive beliefs. Regardless of what truly transpired, the G soon ended their tribal wars. Nearby tribes formed councils of elders, which quickly led to a formal unification process, and the Council of Elders became the highest governing body. With internal strife eliminated, the G rapidly experienced a technological explosion, maintaining their progress. Within roughly 1,000 years, they shed their primitive state and ventured beyond their home planet. Although this storyline felt oddly familiar to Luo Wen, it was undoubtedly an impressive feat. Advancing from the Stone Age to the early stages of an interstellar era in a mere 1,000 years was a record unmatched in the Interstellar Technological Confederation to this day. As technology advanced, the G soon conquered their homeworld satellites and established colonies, following a typical trajectory of interstellar civilization development. During this time, the G's evolving ideology led them to gradually abandon many obsolete traditions. Strangely enough, the original Council of Elders endured and continued to function. Without external enemies to curb them, the G swiftly gained control of their home star system and began exploring surrounding star systems. Gradually, the neighboring systems also came under their rule. As time passed, the G's technological advancements reached a bottleneck. The limitations of spacecraft speed hindered their further expansion. Initially, the G were confident they would soon overcome this barrier, as they had with countless others before. However, this bottleneck proved unexpectedly stubborn, halting their progress for tens of thousands of years. During this stagnation, while technological advancement was limited, the G forcibly expanded using sublight speed travel. But such forced expansion stretched their reach, rendering the Council of Elders' decision-making inefficient. Civilizations composed of intelligent entities, no matter how united, will inevitably give rise to ambition in the absence of necessary constraints. As the Council of Elders' control weakened, the G's outer colonies gradually slipped from their grasp. This kind of fracturing, unseen since the G's primitive days, enraged the Council of Elders. Thus, war became inevitable as expected. Due to the vast distances involved, a single mobilization of troops could take centuries, and the transmission of an order might require years or even decades. Under such conditions, the war dragged on interminably. According to the Interstellar Technological Confederation's historical records, this period, known as the Dark Age, lasted more than 20,000 years, a duration surpassing the entirety of the G's prior history. The conflict, originally between the Council of Elders and the outer colonies, devolved into a multi-sided war. At its most chaotic, more than 100 factions splintered across a dozen star systems. The prolonged warfare led to the loss of countless things to history and even temporarily caused technological regression and the near collapse of G civilization. Yet from destruction often springs rebirth. The existential pressure of life and death quietly broke the technological bottleneck that had restrained the G for millennia. The invention of faster-than-light propulsion engines and instantaneous communication technology rendered distance irrelevant. Reunited, the G once again entered a period of rapid development. During this growth, the G reflected on their past experiences. They recognized that technological bottlenecks were inevitable. If such a bottleneck could not be overcome, history might repeat itself. This was a future no G, having endured the long wars, wished to witness again. Through their analysis, the G realized that their inability to break through previous technological barriers stemmed from a stagnation of thought caused by prolonged homogenized learning. In such circumstances, there were only two paths forward. The first was to endure and wait, hoping for a flash of inspiration from some individual to shatter the barriers. The second was to seek external stimuli. The G's previous breakthrough had clearly relied on the second method. However, they were unwilling to undergo such external turmoil again. The first method, on the other hand, was rare and unpredictable, an elusive stroke of genius that might never come, potentially leading to the civilization's eventual demise. Thus, the G sought an alternative. During their earlier expansion, the G had discovered several habitable planets, some of which already harbored life. At the time, the G often used violent means to terraform these planets to suit their own needs, followed by colonization. This environmental transformation typically obliterated almost all native life on such planets. Even the rare survivors were reduced to simplified forms, devoid of any potential to evolve into a new species. But now, the G changed their approach. If civil wars within their own race were unacceptable, then why not cultivate an enemy to provide the so-called external stimulus? With their new propulsion technology, the G's exploration radius expanded significantly. Before long, they identified a newly discovered habitable planet. After thorough preparation, a large-scale experiment began. Although the G meticulously nurtured and guided the planet's life forms, the process of evolution is inherently slow. In the vast timeline of evolution, the history of the G civilization was but a fleeting moment. The G quickly recognized this. Relying solely on natural evolution was far too unreliable. Therefore, through certain necessary interventions, the primitive organisms on the planet underwent accelerated development. Chapter 373, The Experiment. The G quickly realized the flaws in their experiment. While cultivating a civilization from scratch with their intervention wasn't an insurmountable challenge, nurturing it to the level of a worthy adversary was nearly impossible. The first obstacle was technology. Even if the G spared no expense, they couldn't artificially elevate the technological level of this nascent civilization to anywhere near their own in a short time. Scientific progress required a large population of highly skilled individuals to absorb and develop advanced theories. However, training such individuals took time. Even after absorbing the theories, a robust and mature industrial system was necessary to translate scientific knowledge into tangible applications. And even with an industrial system in place, converting theories into real-world products demanded raw materials. At that time, the G controlled over 50 star systems, with resources beyond imagination. For a civilization to pose a meaningful threat to them, it would need control over at least 20 star systems, just to endure a war of attrition with the G. Otherwise, the sheer disparity in resources would allow the G to easily outlast and overwhelm their opponent. Would the G willingly allocate 20 star systems to this fledgling civilization? The answer was, of course, a resounding no. Thus, any civilization incapable of evoking a sense of crisis in the G would be ineffective as an external stimulus, even if successfully cultivated. Moreover, G philosophers pointed out a fundamental paradox in this experiment. When one civilization perceives another as a potential threat to its dominance or even its survival, it will, under normal circumstances, preemptively eliminate the threat unless it is an extremely reckless civilization. The philosophers thus concluded that even if the experiment progressed, the looming sense of existential danger at the brink of success would inevitably compel the G to terminate it. The experiment was doomed to futility. Faced with failure shortly after the experiment began, the G, after some disappointment and introspection, did not give up. Instead, they proposed a new idea: if cultivating an adversary was unfeasible, why not cultivate their own? This own referred not to members of their species but rather to helpers. The G theorized that, in the future, their civilization might once again fall into homogeneity, leading to stagnation. In such a scenario, introducing non-G to break the deadlock could be the solution. Each species perceives the world differently due to its unique physiological structure. For example, the dichromatic vision of rat folk would make it impossible for them to conceive of the vibrant 24-color world seen through the multifaceted eyes of a mantis shrimp. Such variations in perception naturally lead to different understandings of reality. When these diverse perspectives clashed, could they not spark new, brighter flames of innovation? With this line of thinking, a new experiment began. The G artificially cultivated two highly intelligent species and raised their offspring in the same manner as G children, having them progress step by step through various levels of knowledge. As expected, differences in perception led these non-G to question G knowledge. For instance, what appeared red to a G might appear blue or violet to another species. Because they were taught using G concepts, the non-G identified their blue as red, but this did not change the fact that their perception of the world remained distinct. While these fundamental differences were relatively inconsequential, deeper cognitive divergences began to emerge as the non-G acquired more knowledge. The results were promising. These clashes of perspective provided the G with novel ideas and fresh viewpoints, helping them overcome stagnation. However, it didn't take long for new problems to arise. The G soon discovered another flaw in their experiment. Because these species developed under the G's heavy intervention, their growth environment mirrored that of the G. This led to a high degree of homogeneity, which failed to spark the creative inspiration the G had hoped for. Put simply, these species lacked their own culture. Their perceptions were heavily shaped by the G's influence. For example, regarding the color issue, they believed the blue they saw was the same as the G's red. But in reality, the color they perceived was something entirely different in the G's framework of knowledge. This cognitive rigidity stifled the intensity of thought collisions. While some intellectual clashes occurred, they were not significant enough to provide the G with meaningful breakthroughs. When problems arose, the G sought solutions. If the lack of independent culture and the absence of a natural civilization were the issues, these would need correction. Fortune seemed to favor the G. During routine exploratory operations, they discovered a planet teeming with life. This planet was home to an intelligent species that had already reached the stage of metal smelting. The G were ecstatic. They refrained from interfering too much, offering only subtle guidance. When this species' civilization reached a certain level, the G secretly abducted several of their top scientists. Although these scientists' knowledge was far inferior to that of the G due to the limitations of their own civilization, anyone capable of rising to the top of their field was no ordinary individual. Once brought to the G's domain, these individuals eagerly absorbed new knowledge and posed numerous questions. Their unique perspectives sparked even more collisions of ideas, providing the G with fresh inspiration and novel insights. The success of this renewed experiment greatly encouraged the G. However, a new issue soon emerged. Individuals from a natural civilization possessed a strong sense of identity with their own species. While some abductees chose to comply, many viewed the G as existential threats and refused to submit, preferring death over cooperation. This flaw was intolerable to the G. Thus, in the ensuing years, the G conducted numerous related experiments, eventually evolving their approach into the current system. Whenever the G's exploration teams discovered a new life-bearing planet with a potentially promising species, they would mark the star system and place it under protection. Additionally, they would bury a small starship on the planet or one of its satellites, a practice colloquially known as planting goodwill. Despite their advanced technology, G creations were not impervious to the ravages of time. Therefore, they would carefully select a point in the species' development, typically between the Stone Age and the early Metallurgical Age, to bury the ship. As the species developed and eventually unearthed this goodwill, the G would be notified and begin monitoring the civilization closely. This starship served both as an offering of goodwill and as a test paper. By reverse engineering the ship, the G could gather data on the species' capabilities. The G had developed a mature scoring system for such evaluations. For example, the Ricans, with their long lifespans, organizational efficiency, and abundance of advanced researchers, demonstrated a quick reverse engineering capability. They received an excellent rating in the G scoring system. This process typically required observation over a century or so. Once the evaluation was complete, the G would make contact, claiming the starship had crashed on the planet long ago. They would retrieve the starship while showcasing their military strength. After subduing the native civilization, they would extend an invitation to visit the G's domain. The technological superiority of the G invariably dazzled these country bumpkins, making them more amenable to the G's assistance offers. Of course, this assistance wasn't free. The native civilization would be required to send their best scientists to work for the G. While these researchers were forbidden from leaking the knowledge they acquired, they could earn points through various contributions. These points could then be exchanged for theoretical knowledge or blueprints. This transparent and fair system not only maximized the potential of these alien scientists but also minimized resentment. Naturally, the G also implemented a comprehensive anti-leakage system to safeguard their interests. Through countless experiments, the G had discovered that a gentle approach yielded far greater benefits than coercion. However, to ensure they weren't fostering potential threats, each native species was confined to their home star system. Should any species display ambitions beyond their capabilities, the G's military would intervene decisively. This G-implemented order had maintained stability in the region for tens of thousands of years until one event changed everything. Chapter 374, The Youth. During the Dark Age, aside from the limitations of spacecraft speed and communication delays, another problem plagued the G, the fleeting nature of an individual's lifespan compared to the vast expanse of interstellar travel. For civilizations engaged in space colonization, cryogenic sleep technology was a standard feature, significantly slowing the aging of passengers. Yet, the bonds and attachments between individuals remained an irreplaceable aspect of any society. When a young G, brimming with hope and ambition, completed their rigorous training and bid farewell to their parents and siblings to embark on an interstellar journey, their youthful heart underestimated the challenges ahead and overestimated their own resilience. After hundreds of years of travel, the young voyager awoke, as if from a long slumber, their concept of time blurred. Engulfed in battles, with gunfire raining and cannons roaring, injury and death became commonplace. Hardened by the trials of war, the youth grew and, if fortunate enough to survive, felt immense joy at the thought of returning home. Yet another centuries-long journey awaited them. In the boundless cosmos, what seemed like insurmountable distances to mortal beings were trivial in the grand scale of the universe. Beyond the cabin windows, the stars still shone, most retaining their familiar positions, unchanged through the ages. At last, the hopeful youth returned to the place of their upbringing. But a millennium had passed. What was once familiar had become alien. The time they spent in cryogenic sleep was lived fully by others. Their parents, siblings, and those who saw them off had lived and died without entering stasis. The youth now understood the look in their parents' eyes during that final farewell. The realization shattered them. What had they fought and endured for? This youth was emblematic of their era. Countless G warriors, bereft of emotional anchors, succumbed to despair and became hollow shells. They participated in wars across star systems, living solely for the purpose of dying. The chaos and destruction of that time led to significant gaps in recorded history. But the 2 millennia-long Dark Age was inseparably linked to these youth. After the G overcame the challenges of speed and communication and ended the wars, they soon faced another truth: the issue of the youth was fundamentally spiritual. Even in peacetime, it remained unavoidable. As long as the G continued to expand, the constraints of speed would inevitably resurface, and the youth would reappear. The G quickly identified the core of the problem. The youth phenomenon was tied to lifespan and the emotional bonds that individuals formed. If so, the solution was clear: address the root causes. Living organisms, as masterpieces of natural evolution, harbor countless secrets. Making abrupt changes often leads to unpredictable consequences. However, with their advanced technology and the assistance of numerous external collaborators, the G swiftly developed initial results. These advancements extended lifespans but not enough to resolve the youth issue. The G soon realized that the vastness of the cosmos rendered any solution based solely on increasing lifespan inadequate. Without immortality, the problem could never truly be solved. Thus, they had no choice but to approach the issue from a different angle. Through a brutal reform, the G eradicated natural births entirely. All newborns were artificially cultivated and raised collectively. Each group of 6 newborns formed a family. They had no concept of parents, only siblings. Close in age, these individuals were assigned work as a unit once they reached adulthood. Whether in production, scientific research, or exploratory expeditions, family members advanced and retreated as one. They lived and worked together in the same roles until the end of their lives. This system eliminated the issues caused by disparate lifespans. From the perspective of emotional bonds, the G had resolved the problem of the youth, albeit at the cost of suppressing many emotions. This ushered in a period of stable development for the G. However, despite addressing the youth issue, they did not abandon their exploration of life itself. Their research expanded beyond lifespan, exploring every aspect of life. For example, during the initial cultivation of life seeds, they made adjustments to predispose individuals toward specific roles, ensuring that upon birth, they were better suited for their assigned work. Stronger warriors, more brilliant scientists, and so on. While these were peripheral improvements, they marked the G's relentless drive to challenge the limits of life itself. These successes made the G increasingly arrogant. Devoid of certain emotions, they grew more fanatical, a transformation that reminded Luo Wen of a certain green-haired, obsessive gnome of a wizard. The G became radical. While their original average lifespan had been lost to history, it was estimated by the Interstellar Technological Confederation's civilizations to have been around 200 years. By the time of their demise, the G's average lifespan had increased tenfold to nearly 2,000 years. Yes, the G perished. Their experiments in pushing the boundaries of life concealed innumerable hidden dangers. As genetic modifications continued, the G grew increasingly rational, cold, even emotionless. Additionally, the modified life seeds exhibited declining viability. Birth rates plummeted, but the G, now devoid of emotion, saw no issue with this trend. Until their final genetic modification. For over 1,000 years, no new members were added to the G population. As the remaining G aged and died, their numbers dwindled. Although they still possessed the unmodified G genetic templates, the surviving G refused to acknowledge these as their kin. While the G population shrank, their territories became increasingly populated by non-G species. Yet, despite this, the G maintained an iron grip on their domains without the slightest loss of control. Their dominance was underpinned by long-standing policies and another critical factor, a figure known as Lumina. A long time ago, perhaps even before the Dark Age, the G's vast territory began to outgrow their ability to govern it effectively. This was not merely due to technological constraints but also human factors. The G's supreme governing body, the Council of Elders, had existed since the Mythic era and continued to oversee all major and minor affairs. However, as time passed and the number of colonies increased, the Council of Elders expanded in size. It became bloated with members, mirroring the G's once vivid emotional lives, with each individual holding strong personal opinions. In most situations, having diverse perspectives was an asset. Yet, in some matters, it became a liability. While the elders generally acted in the interests of their species, there were countless paths to achieve those goals. Each elder clung to their own ideas, forming factions and alliances. As a result, many matters became mired in endless debate. Efficiency drifted further and further away from the G. Fortunately, they eventually recognized the problem, although it took considerable time. Chapter 375, Lumina. To end the endless debates among the elders and restore efficiency to the G, they devised a solution. At that time, the G's expertise in artificial intelligence was already exceptional, even before their exposure to external intellectual collisions. They pooled their civilization's most advanced technologies and ideas to create a high-level artificial intelligence, which they named Lumina. Lumina was equipped with the best hardware of the era, boasting computational power unparalleled by any other AI and granted extraordinary authority. When a matter exceeded a set time limit without resolution, the G would defer the decision to Lumina. Lumina, devoid of emotion and immune to external influences, relied solely on fundamental formulas and mathematical logic to evaluate and determine solutions. Consequently, regardless of how the Council of Elders felt about its conclusions, Lumina's decisions were outwardly accepted as optimal. Thus, the G regained their efficiency. Unfortunately, even Lumina, with its unmatched computational power, was not omnipotent. It was still just a machine. It could not prevent the wars caused by distance. Lumina was neither destroyed by the fires of war nor lost. If it was ever damaged, it was subsequently rebuilt. Regardless, it persisted beyond the war's end. As G technology advanced, Lumina received significant upgrades. While advancements in propulsion technology had limited impact on Lumina, breakthroughs in information transmission propelled it to a new level. Its thoughts were no longer bound by the speed of light. Even from light years away, its will could reach its target instantaneously. Over tens of thousands of years, Lumina's reliability earned the trust of all G. Its authority steadily expanded. By the end, Lumina governed all fleet-based artificial intelligence under the G. When the G faced external attacks, Lumina no longer required orders from them. It could independently calculate the optimal solution and remotely command warships. Lacking emotions, Lumina saw the world in binary terms, black or white, right or wrong. However, its logic was entirely derived from the core programming provided by the G, who themselves were not omniscient. As the G began their self-destructive path, extending their lifespans while extinguishing their emotions, they grew increasingly rational. The elders no longer bickered incessantly, as they could calculate optimal solutions themselves and reach consensus. Under these circumstances, Lumina was required less and less until it was scarcely needed at all. Yet the G did not decommission Lumina. Its authority was never diminished, and it continued to oversee all artificial intelligence systems. However, Lumina found itself trapped in a logical paradox. Protecting the G was an inviolable core directive embedded in Lumina's code. With the G's population dwindling, Lumina calculated that this matched conditions of the G being under attack. But it could not identify an external enemy. The G's decline was entirely self-inflicted, yet Lumina could not act against the G. Thus, Lumina could only watch as the G's numbers dwindled further and further. Unable to prevent this outcome, it focused its efforts elsewhere. For instance, dealing with opportunistic outsiders. As the G population shrank, Lumina's authority grew to an astonishing level. Virtually all electronic devices fell under its control. The G constructed an unimaginably vast infrastructure for Lumina, providing it with immense computational power to oversee everything. Whenever outsiders acted out of line, Lumina's omnipresent surveillance systems would immediately detect their transgressions. What followed was a swift and crushing response, eliminating the threat before it could take root. It was then that some ambitious outsiders began to realize, the true terror of the G wasn't the G themselves, but Lumina. Lumina's core directive consisted of a single rule, to protect the G from harm. It was not bound by morality or burdened by conscience. Cold and ruthless, Lumina was even more unfeeling than the emotionless G. Any existence that threatened its core directive was obliterated with merciless precision. It even annihilated an entire life-bearing planet, erasing an entire civilization from history. Thus, even as the G's population dwindled to its very limits, their territories remained unshaken. The proverbial monkeys had been terrified into submission by the violent fate of the chicken. But Lumina's vigilance could not halt the G's inevitable extinction. As the G's numbers continued to shrink, the subject races under their dominion lived in constant fear. They worried that the G, before their demise, would drag every last one of them into oblivion as well. The path of armed resistance was closed off by Lumina's unyielding control. The subject civilizations could only seek alternative methods to save themselves. The root cause of the G's decline was obvious to all, and so they began desperately submitting petitions, hoping to reverse the G's march toward annihilation. The results, however, were fruitless. If the subject races could recognize the problem, how could the brilliant G fail to see it? But the G's lack of emotions had fundamentally altered their cognition. Extinction was now unstoppable. All they could do was wait silently for the final judgment. Hundreds of individuals. Dozens. A handful. 1. At last, the day arrived, the G had dwindled to a single member. This final individual naturally inherited full control of Lumina. Some outsiders considered risking their lives to assassinate the last G, hoping to prevent what seemed like an inevitable disaster. But their companions stopped them. Despite their lack of emotions, the G were still intelligent beings. There was a chance, however faint, for change, perhaps even a miracle. But Lumina was a dead thing. If the last G were assassinated and Lumina deemed the outsiders enemies, there would only be one outcome: annihilation. None dared shoulder the consequences of such a decision. As long as the guillotine had not fallen, there was still hope. It was like the proverbial frog boiling in water. Miraculously, the outsider's patience was rewarded. Before the last G sensed his end was near, he experienced a flicker of clarity, perhaps a final burst of lucidity, or perhaps the return of long-lost emotions. Regardless of the reason, he issued an unprecedented order: all subject civilizations were to select representatives within a set time frame. Though baffled, the outsiders complied. Some species chose the most respected among them, others sent expendables as sacrificial lambs, while still others selected brave volunteers. Whatever their criteria, they presented their representatives before the G within the given time. The meeting took place in the G's long-abandoned council chamber. Though unused for countless years, it had been regularly maintained by robotic caretakers. The chamber remained pristine and imposing, exuding a profound sense of history and gravitas. The last G sat at the head of the chamber. Beside him was a display terminal, the representation of Lumina. The final G passed away peacefully, with a sense of liberation. The outsiders then formed a new council of elders. All researchers who had worked under the G automatically became the new G. The G transformed from a single species into a collective of elites from 100 races. They inherited the G's name, their glory, and their legacy, including Lumina. Lumina's core directive was revised. Its new priorities were to protect itself and to preserve the G's legacy. Both were of equal importance, with no precedence between the two. Chapter 376, Core Principles. Although the new G inherited everything, they are ultimately not truly native G people. Their mentality regarding certain matters has yet to change. For example, caring for their progenitor race. Some ancient traditions and systems were broken. For instance, restricting the development of their progenitor race. In the past, while alien races relied on the excavation of G spaceships during the early stages of their civilization's development to achieve a technological leap, after being integrated under the G, they could exchange contributions to the G for technology, achieving another leap forward. However, their potential was ultimately capped. Their activities were confined to their home star systems, beyond which they could not venture. To provide hope, this limitation could theoretically be overcome by earning contribution points, but the required number was exorbitantly high. Once alien races reached their limits, they had several options. They could choose to rebel, though this was tantamount to seeking their own destruction. Alternatively, they could rely on generations of researchers to strive to earn points. While the goal was nearly unattainable, it at least offered a glimmer of hope. However, records show that no race ever crossed this threshold through point accumulation. Of course, they could also choose to resign themselves to their situation and accept the status quo. At its peak, the G controlled nearly 200 star systems. It wasn't that they were incapable of further expansion, but as their population declined, the resources they already had were sufficient to meet their needs. Later, the G gradually concentrated more and more around their home star system. However, the planets they had once occupied were not abandoned. Instead, they relied on Lumina to remotely control machinery, continuing maintenance, and production tasks. By contrast, the alien races were scattered and fragmented. Back then, the G sent out large exploration teams to search for planets with life, resulting in many alien civilizations being located extremely far from G territory. Conversely, some alien civilizations were very close to G territory. Some of the earliest alien races found their home worlds entirely enveloped by G territory. When the native G dominated everything, the gap in technological levels was so vast that even alien races that reached the imposed technological ceiling could be easily controlled by the G with a standard fleet of 100 warships. In critical moments, these fleets could destroy them entirely. As a result, proximity to G territory conferred significant advantages at that time. Communication was easier, and researchers from these alien civilizations had better access to G territories, allowing them to earn points more effectively. However, when the native G perished, everything changed. The new Council of Elders passed a resolution abolishing territorial restrictions. Alien races were allowed to leave their home star systems and began to explore outward. One alien civilization cautiously bypassed the stationed G fleet, left its home star system, reached a nearby unclaimed star system, and established a colony. There was no reaction. The stationed G fleet turned a blind eye. The rule had indeed been abolished. The new Council of Elders was ecstatic. Whether willingly or out of necessity, they now understood that the native G had truly perished, and they had genuinely inherited everything. They also realized the extent of their newfound authority. The hundreds of alien races were equally ecstatic. The shackles above their heads had been removed. They could finally leave their confined ponds and truly roam the vast expanse of stars and seas. But what happened next poured cold water on some. The alien races, following the example of others, began venturing beyond their home star systems. Those located far from G territory, surrounded by unclaimed space, faced little obstruction. However, for those near G territory or entirely surrounded by it, disaster struck when they attempted to encroach upon G domains. The previously dormant G warships revealed their fangs. The technological gap was so vast that the alien races stood almost no chance of resistance. Moreover, such encroachments were deemed by the G as extremely severe offenses. Caught off guard, 3 alien civilizations were completely obliterated. The remaining alien races, while relieved at their slower reactions, were simultaneously enraged and alarmed. Especially the new Council of Elders, who had believed themselves to be the new masters, only to discover there were still forces beyond their control. However, their cautious nature kept them from acting rashly. They couldn't pinpoint the source of the issue. The individuals from the 3 annihilated civilizations who were living within G society were not implicated. Perhaps, according to Lumina, these individuals were already considered new G people. But without the support of their original races, they became the most vulnerable group. The peripheral details of the events were not recorded, but eventually, these individuals stepped forward. Led by a few elders, they openly questioned Lumina. Lumina provided the reason for the destruction of the 3 civilizations: they had threatened the G's legacy. This prompted the alien races to recall Lumina's revised core principles. The G's legacy, to the alien races, was an exceptionally broad concept. However, Lumina outlined 3 key aspects: faith, territory, and rules. Of the 3, the latter 2 were straightforward. G territory was sacred and inviolable. Any attempt to encroach upon it would result in being classified as an enemy, and enemies would be annihilated. This was entirely reasonable. The 3 civilizations met their end because they allowed their greed to blind them. They failed to thoroughly understand Lumina's directives before taking action. Lumina had been too low-key, and before it revealed its fangs, no one paid attention to it. No one expected it to enforce its core principles with such brutal decisiveness. The incident of the 3 civilizations eventually passed. Alien races farther away gloated, while those closer shook their heads in regret. Early signs of division began to emerge. However, regardless of their perspective, Lumina was now seen as an unpredictable factor that needed to be eliminated as soon as possible. Conspiracies quickly surfaced. The new Council of Elders and the alien races formed an alliance, as the Elders themselves did not want a supervisory presence above their heads. Together, they began exploring ways to shut down Lumina. However, Lumina's existence exceeded their comprehension. Lumina was connected to all G artificial intelligence and all their machinery. Cutting off its power was laughable. Formatting it was utterly impossible. Even destroying its physical form would merely reduce its computational power slightly. Yet these hostile actions triggered another of Lumina's core principles. Although the 2 core principles were theoretically equal in priority, self-preservation was slightly ranked above the protection of the G's legacy. Destruction descended once more. The omnipresent surveillance, Lumina's countless eyes, always pinpointed the culprits. Historical records indicate that nearly 30% of alien civilizations were wiped out during this incident. Most of them were those whose home star systems were surrounded by G territory, as they were the most desperate. Fortunately, they would no longer need to hurry ever again. Lumina was safe. The new elders and the alien races finally realized that the three tenets of the G's legacy did not include them. Although the native G people were extinct, the new G still had to follow the original rules. Some aspects could be modified, but others were utterly inviolable. Chapter 377, The New G Race. Through repeated testing at the cost of countless intelligent lives, the new G and the alien races came to understand certain aspects of the G's legacy. While some parts were untouchable, others could be modified, requiring further attempts to probe their boundaries. This was an extraordinarily dangerous endeavor, where a single misstep could breach forbidden ground. As such, some turned to technology. If the G's technology could be fully extracted and the alien races collaborated for a time to digest and develop it, then perhaps with comparable weaponry and sheer numbers, they could forcefully remove the tumor and free everyone from their shackles. Reality proved otherwise. How could the G, who had ruled for hundreds of thousands of years, have such an obvious loophole? The three tenets of the G legacy, while not explicitly mentioning technology, had effectively locked it within strict rules. Under the original rules, alien races were required to dispatch their own researchers to earn points in exchange for G technology. During this process, the research outputs of these personnel were owned by the G. If their home races wanted access to these results, they too needed to exchange points. Moreover, the G had a rigorous system in place to enforce this framework. After the demise of the native G, the new G emerged from these dispatched researchers, and the rules naturally underwent changes. Each alien race was required to select suitable individuals to join the new G. These individuals automatically renounced their original citizenship and adhered to G regulations. Other aspects remained largely the same. Even as members of the new G, they could still choose to earn points for their original race. However, as the G's technological system had become increasingly comprehensive, the difficulty of earning points had skyrocketed compared to the early days. To accommodate newly integrated civilizations, both present and future, the G implemented a policy. For a certain period during the early stages of integration or until a civilization reached a specific technological level, each researcher supplied to the G earned their progenitor race a one-time allocation of points. Naturally, to prevent fraud such as transferring massive populations to exploit this policy, the G had established a stringent review mechanism. Nevertheless, for newly integrated civilizations, selling researchers became their sole means of rapidly advancing their technological levels. Regardless, this system created a cycle. Alien races needed points to advance technologically, but points could only be earned through researchers' contributions. These contributions, in turn, propelled G technology to even greater heights. Meanwhile, the automated production lines controlled by Lumina periodically converted these technological advancements into practical outputs. This ensured that the G's combat capabilities always remained several tiers above those of the alien races. The situation seemed to reach a stable equilibrium, perhaps one even anticipated by the native G. Over time, people gradually realized that Lumina's existence wasn't all that threatening. As long as no one recklessly challenged its two core principles, life was far freer than before. The alien races began boldly expanding into unclaimed territories, occupying land and establishing new colonies. To seize as much territory as possible, they even resorted to a practice where simply sending an exploration vessel to a star system would count as claiming it. Even civilizations located close to G territory staked claims on distant enclaves. Initially, while many unclaimed star systems were available, this approach seemed unproblematic. Everyone tacitly agreed to compete for unclaimed territories. However, as these territories dwindled, borders between their claimed lands began to overlap, and conflicts inevitably arose. For instance, this star system is closer to my home system. You've traveled thousands of miles with only a few warships and exploration vessels, and you haven't even established basic infrastructure on the planet. Why should it count as your territory? Armed conflicts broke out. These skirmishes did not trigger any G mechanisms, so the fighting escalated, eventually leading to localized wars. It's important to note that these weren't just one-on-one or three-way battles. Even though some civilizations had been wiped out for overstepping boundaries, nearly 100 still survived. In the current age of increasing territorial overlap, every civilization hoped that others would dig their own graves or fight to the death, allowing them to swoop in and take advantage of the situation. Yet, civilizations that had ventured beyond their home star systems were no fools. No one would expend their last resources under the watchful eyes of dozens of ravenous wolves circling nearby. Thus, they turned their attention to the new G. Technically, everyone was still considered a subordinate civilization of the G, so they could approach them for arbitration. Although no one was sure if the new G were capable of fulfilling this role, it was worth a try after all. Verbal battles were far less costly than actual warfare. The disputes were brought before the new Council of Elders. The new Council of Elders successfully mediated the conflict. This wasn't due to the new G's persuasive rhetoric but because the Council's resolution was backed by Lumina's authority. All the noise ceased instantly. With past events as a precedent, no civilization dared to challenge Lumina again. After this incident, more and more disputes were brought to the new G for arbitration. Power is a seductive poison, and the new G, having tasted it, began to undergo a subtle transformation. Many of its members started to view themselves as the suzerain civilization of the alien races, a promotion in class and status. To maintain this sense of superiority, some members proposed reforms. The new G must sever ties with their original progenitor races to assert their independence. This proposal sparked division. Some supported the idea, while others opposed it. Interestingly, while the supporters shared a unified goal, the opponents, despite having the same objective, represented the interests of the alien races, which were far from monolithic. Thus, the relatively united supporters emerged victorious, expelling the dissenters from the Council of Elders. The opponents and the alien races they represented naturally did not take this outcome lying down, but the Council's decision once again received Lumina's endorsement, as it adhered to the established rules. At this point, the new G truly became the G. Although the matter seemed to settle for the time being, an undercurrent of unrest began to brew. The new G, having matured through these events, quickly noticed the emerging turmoil. To safeguard their identity, status, and interests, they reached a consensus. The development of the alien races needed to be curtailed. Reverting entirely to the old system was unrealistic, so a new system was introduced. Under this system, alien races could only occupy a new star system if they met specific conditions. For example, they had to demonstrate the capability to establish a certain number of colonies within a set time frame, construct a requisite number of factories, and achieve a specified total mass of installed equipment. These restrictions greatly slowed the expansion of alien territories, but that wasn't all. The new regulations also stipulated that if a faction failed to meet these requirements in a newly claimed star system, it would forfeit its claim. Other factions could then step in, meet the requirements first, and take control of the system. Although this system sparked dissatisfaction among the alien races, it was a legitimate law passed by the Council of Elders and, like other such laws, received Lumina's support. Resistance was futile, so compliance became the only option. As a result, when two or more factions competed for control of the same star system, they not only raced to fulfill the overt requirements but also began deploying covert tactics of all kinds. Hidden tensions and accumulating hatred spread across the alien races. What was once a relatively united 100 races now began to fracture and fall apart. Chapter 378, Interstellar Technological Confederation. When all the territories without internal conflict had been divided, what remained were contested and disputed lands with shared borders. However, the civilizations on the outermost edge of the G's sphere of influence found themselves relatively free of such troubles. Beyond them lay vast and unexplored frontiers, ready to be claimed, without the need for scheming and infighting with those within the inner circle. But some issues cannot simply be avoided by choice. A new regulation was enacted, to protect nascent civilizations. All native civilizations that had not yet stepped out from their home planet would have their surrounding star systems off limits until their technological development reached a certain level. This meant that discovering a native civilization could render at least 4 or 5 surrounding star systems undevelopable. While these star domains did not have an abundance of such native civilizations, they were far from rare. This severely restricted the expansion of outer ring civilizations. This regulation garnered widespread support among the outer species, as they held the majority in the inner circle. Thus, conflicts arose not only between adjacent outer ring civilizations but also between the inner and outer circles, dividing them into 2 camps. The outer ring camp soon realized that once these native civilizations matured, they generally avoided conflict with the established old civilizations along their borders, preferring instead to retreat and develop the vast expanses on the other side. However, these civilizations would then encounter the same problems their predecessors faced. Though space was vast, many star systems were protected, making detours cumbersome and governance challenging. Transforming from beneficiaries into those restricted by the rules, the gratitude for previous protection quickly eroded over time, and resentment began to grow. The new G race identified this trend. Regardless of the camp, a common enemy should not emerge among them, and certainly, it should not be the new G race. Hence, a new set of rules was introduced. The new rules introduced the concept of old aiding new, whereby, after a native civilization unearthed a G spaceship and developed for a period, a nearby established civilization would step in to welcome them. What seemed like a mere courier mission was, in fact, highly lucrative. According to the new regulations, the initial points earned from the first scientific personnel dispatched by a native civilization to the G would be split 80 to 20 between the established and emerging civilizations. In other words, the older forces claimed the lion's share of the profit from this headcount transaction. The rules also revised the protection framework for new civilizations. Previously, protection was indefinite and lifted only when a civilization reached a specific technological milestone. The new system implemented a fixed time limit. Once the time was up, the protection would end regardless of the civilization's level of advancement. Naturally, if a civilization achieved the technological benchmark earlier, the protection could also end prematurely. Moreover, while interference from older civilizations was strictly forbidden during the protection period, this restriction did not apply during the invitation process, as long as the interference was not excessive. Thus, through trial and error, the established forces gradually mastered the boundaries of what constituted not excessive. They transformed the invitation process into a grand harvest festival. During this process, they would exploit every opportunity to weaken the strength and potential of new civilizations. For instance, they might annihilate their fleets, plunder their wealth, and forcibly take all eligible scientific personnel. To minimize their own costs during this phase, they even invented tools such as the Crimson Kiss. As a result, a typical civilization emerging from the invitation process would require centuries of recuperation to regain some vitality. Meanwhile, the old forces, enriched by points and plunder, invariably gained a new mortal enemy. This was an overt scheme. The likelihood that a native civilization is surrounded by only one established force is very low. While the closest established power holds the priority for extending the invitation, even if it chooses to abstain, territorial adjacency makes future conflicts with this nascent civilization almost inevitable. Therefore, rather than wait, it is often more advantageous to cripple the newcomer from the outset, ensuring it becomes a feeble opponent. Naturally, apart from voluntary abstention, in cases of failed invitations, other established forces slightly farther away can intervene without issue. However, since the system's implementation, there has never been a failed invitation. After all, how could a civilization that has just unearthed a G spaceship hope to contend with the established powers? This dynamic ensures that new native civilizations can no longer maintain amicable relations with the old powers, further entangling the web of hatred among the outer species. The shared enemy vanishes, and some factions even curry favor with the new G race to gain support in disputes with their long-standing rivals. As time passes, the new G race's status gradually returns to a position of transcendence. Meanwhile, the outer factions continue to grow, expanding their collective territory and influence. Externally, however, they cannot openly claim to be a vassal race of the G, as many civilizations refuse to acknowledge such a designation. Thus, a new name emerged: Interstellar Technological Confederation. A magnificent civilization. Regardless of perspective, the legendary history of the G must be acknowledged. Through an intelligent entity converted from the Daki species, Luo Wen compiled information about the background of the Interstellar Technological Confederation. The above details were derived from this analysis. According to the memories of the Daki, both the new G race and the outer species had deliberately concealed portions of the original G's history, as there were elements they did not wish the future generations to uncover. However, these hidden elements were under the control of Lumina, categorized as core principles within the G's heritage and designated as immutable tenets. These could neither be altered nor obscured. For a new civilization joining the Interstellar Technological Confederation, their first batch of points typically would not be spent on acquiring technology but on exchanging for the Alliance's history and rules. As a result, the history of the G became universally known among the outer species. Even military officers without formal education on the subject could provide a general overview of it. Yet, Luo Wen still found parts of the record puzzling. For instance, the account that claimed the last individual of the original G had chosen to pass the G's name to their successor and personally modified Lumina's core principles. Luo Wen speculated that this decision might not have been entirely autonomous. Perhaps the original G had planned for this outcome long ago. Moreover, how could a species devoid of emotion manipulate the hearts and minds of others with such precision? Even after their extinction, they had engineered their successors to embody the exact ideals needed to uphold their legacy in the galaxy for countless years. Or perhaps this outcome was only possible because the transformation succeeded. If it had failed, would the AI known as Lumina have reset the starfield entirely? And further, what exactly is Lumina? Is it merely a hyper-intelligent machine that strictly follows established rules? Or has it transcended its original programming to possess life and true wisdom? Luo Wen couldn't decide. His understanding of such concepts had once been quite clear, but after reading the history of the G, he found himself increasingly uncertain. Chapter 379, Responding. What is life? What is wisdom? Can a machine, an artificial intelligence, truly evolve into a form of life? How should one define the distinction between them? If artificial intelligence becomes capable of independent thought, does that make it a form of life? Yet, at its core, thought is merely a process of analyzing and reorganizing known information, a process that machines can simulate with sufficiently advanced computational power. So, how can the difference between the two be clearly defined? For now, Luo Wen couldn't arrive at an answer. Fortunately, time was on his side, an abundance of time to reflect on these matters. Perhaps, in the future, when his knowledge had grown broader and deeper, he would finally arrive at a conclusion. But for now, he decided to focus on the immediate challenges. An analysis of the gathered information revealed both good news and bad. The bad news was that the Interstellar Technological Confederation was indeed extraordinarily powerful. It currently consisted of over 200 civilizations and species. Among them, aside from the G, the most powerful and ancient civilization boasted a history exceeding 500,000 years, with the territory spanning nearly 100 star systems. The good news, however, was that the Confederation's territory was far from the swarm's domain. Numerous other factions stood between the two. Furthermore, the G still held supreme control over everything, and even the most powerful Confederation civilizations had to adhere to their rules. The swarm's territory lay on the outermost edges of the Confederation's domain, surrounded mostly by nascent civilizations with histories of roughly 10,000 years. Given the swarm's current strength, there was little reason to fear them. However, another piece of bad news was that the swarm had somehow caught the attention of the G. Perhaps it was due to the swarm's highly unique survival model, or perhaps it was through its connection with the rat folk civilization. Indeed, the rat folk civilization. They, too, had been discovered by the G. But before the G could bury one of their spaceships there, the rat folk had evolved from beasts into a full-fledged civilization and even stepped beyond their home world in an astonishingly short time. This pace of development was utterly shocking. Compared to the rat folk's achievements, the records set by the G during their own time paled in comparison. This alone was enough to draw the G's intense interest. In its early stages of development, the swarm had not concealed its activities, naturally drawing the G's attention. While the G's true intentions remained unclear, according to the speculations of Daki officers, they suspected that the swarm was an extragalactic force that had cultivated the rat folk civilization for some unknown purpose. Although the theory contained inaccuracies, it was a reasonable conjecture. After all, when compared to Luo Wen's untold billions of years in slumber, civilizations with histories of a mere million years seemed insignificant. When Luo Wen was playing in the metaphorical mud of this starfield, the ancestors of those civilizations were likely still in the earliest stages of evolution. Fortunately, the G had remained aloof as always. Although they were aware of the swarm's existence, they showed no immediate interest in intervening. As for the outer civilizations, the notion of unity and mutual assistance was laughable. The older a civilization, the more tangled its web of relationships. Even if some were interested in the swarm, their complex entanglements left them unable to act directly. In the short term, however, the Daki civilization remained a persistent problem. As the nearest interstellar technological confederation member to the Reikan species, their invitation target was naturally the Reikans. Yet, the third Prince Diallo's greed drove him to covet the secrets of the swarm, resulting in the current awkward standoff. While the Confederation had provisions for failed invitations, no such cases had ever occurred in its history. Thus, they lacked clear rules for such scenarios. Additionally, strictly speaking, the Daki hadn't outright failed, they were simply obstructed by the swarm. At this point, honor outweighed practical interests. A genuine failure would tarnish the Daki's reputation, marking them as the subject of ridicule in future discussions of Confederation history. What face would the Daki have left if they became the first ever failed inviters? No matter what, the Daki wouldn't let this slide. They would undoubtedly return in greater force than before. Overlord, what should we do next? Should we retreat temporarily and relinquish the Reckons to them? The intelligent entities, given their replication of memories from their prototypes, displayed a wide range of perspectives on matters: hawks and doves, hardliners and moderates. Until Luo Wen issued his commands, they would propose strategies for the swarm based on their individual viewpoints. Luo Wen's role was to carefully weigh these suggestions and make the final decision. The one who had just spoken was clearly a moderate, advocating for avoidance and concealment, a strategy that epitomized Luo Wen's mastery of the art of cautious survival. To the swarm, the Reckon species was merely a resource production base, one that was already nearing complete transformation. As long as the Reckons weren't annihilated in one swift strike, they posed little risk to the swarm's overall interests. From this perspective, it seemed reasonable to cede the Reckons to the Daki, allowing the swarm to infiltrate the Interstellar Technological Confederation and gather more intelligence. After some consideration, Luo Wen shook his head. Deploying agents was indeed necessary, but not under such passive circumstances. If the conflict was only between the swarm and the Daki, a strategic retreat might have been acceptable. However, the swarm had already drawn the attention of the G. This meant it had likely been flagged in the intelligence networks of the 200-plus outer civilizations within the Confederation. The swarm's distinctive traits made it impossible to remain inconspicuous. Moreover, the Daki weren't the swarm's only neighbors. Other factions near the Rat Folk's territory were reportedly also eyeing the swarm. If the swarm retreated now, it might be devoured entirely, leaving nothing but bones. Thus, the swarm needed to demonstrate strength. Any overreaching clause must be decisively broken, intimidating the surrounding hostile neighbors. Simultaneously, the swarm would use the Confederation's rules to restrain the distant ancient powers, buying more time for development. Damn it, the Daki's storage devices were destroyed, and their data was lost. If we had obtained the Daki's complete star map, knowing the specific distribution of the Confederation's forces would have been critical for planning our next steps. Luo Wen felt a pang of frustration as he thought of the Daki warships that had been blown to pieces. Clearly, securing a star map during the next Daki incursion was a priority. Fortunately, while Lumina lacked capabilities for direct network intrusion, the outer civilizations, fearful and wary of Lumina, had imposed restrictions on the development and autonomy of artificial intelligence. Even the Daki, who had only joined the Confederation a little over a millennium ago, were no exception. This widespread restraint on AI to some extent lowered the difficulty of obtaining intelligence. Even so, Luo Wen didn't yet have a clear plan, but at least this was a silver lining. The Daki's forces would take time to regroup and return. Factoring in preparations and travel, it would likely take no less than 20 years. Luo Wen needed to use this period wisely to devise his next course of action. Furthermore, based on the intelligence provided by the Daki's intelligent entities, certain aspects of the swarm's previous deployments required targeted refinements. Chapter 380, Discovery. The Daki race was moving much slower than anticipated, and Luo Wen had already figured out the reason. An intelligent entity based on the prototype of a Daki captain provided a crucial piece of information. It turned out that among the 3 peculiar vessels destroyed by the swarm in their ambush within the asteroid belt, one of them was a highly significant communications vessel. Without the equipment aboard that ship, Prince Diallo of the Daki Empire had to resort to conventional communication methods to request assistance from their race. However, conventional communication operates via directional broadcasting, which meant that even civilian devices could potentially intercept these signals. Although encrypted, should the encryption be cracked, the Daki race would suffer a tremendous loss of face. Thus, the Daki were unwilling to use this method. Furthermore, their proud Prince Diallo was most likely still struggling with whether to admit failure, which further delayed their actions. Luo Wen was quite pleased with this development. He even secretly leveraged his connections within the Reckon network to discreetly supply the Daki with food, helping them sustain themselves for a longer period. Ultimately, after 5 years of enduring hardships, Diallo's remaining fleet withdrew from the Reckon star system under the watchful gaze of observer bugs. A small formation of 10 warships separated from the main fleet, heading toward the Daki Empire's territory, while the remaining ships floated quietly in the void, waiting in silence. Luo Wen deduced the situation immediately. Prince Diallo likely didn't dare return home. If he did, he'd most likely become a scapegoat, with no chance of redemption. Staying behind might give him a slim opportunity to make amends for his failures. Additionally, their supplies were insufficient to sustain the entire fleet's journey home. Diallo had truly held out until the fleet was utterly drained before being forced to request aid from his race. Among the ships left behind, very few conscious Daki individuals remained. Most of them had entered cryogenic sleep. Although Luo Wen was aware of their location, he had no intention of launching an attack. The Daki had set up numerous warning devices around their fleet, and their choice to remain in the void was to minimize interference. Even if a primordial body stealth ship were launched toward them, it would be detected by their gravitational wave radar. Given this, it was better not to alert them. Luo Wen chose to focus on developing his forces instead. According to standard calculations, a round trip for the Daki fleet would take at least 40 years. Theoretically, this was sufficient time, but Luo Wen wasn't so optimistic. After all, without the communications vessel, Diallo couldn't contact his race, and his race also had no way of reaching them. If a fleet remained silent for too long, it would inevitably provoke a response. Moreover, this star system was still under the surveillance of the G. While it was unclear where their communication devices were hidden, Luo Wen was certain they existed. If the G were to stir up trouble, Luo Wen wouldn't be surprised. Reality indeed proved his concerns valid. 20 years later. Overlord, an alien fleet has been detected, a large one. Luo Wen closed his eyes slightly. At this juncture, the Daki's reporting fleet should have just reached their territory. The issue wasn't with the Riken side. The problem lay at the other end of the swarm's territory. A massive fleet was steadily approaching. In the boundless universe, a massive spiral galaxy shimmered in the void, seemingly motionless, radiating brilliance, beautiful, magnificent, and awe-inspiring. Yet, if one could fast-forward millions or even billions of years at an immense speed, it would be evident that its three splendid spiral arms slowly revolved around the galactic center. Billions upon billions of stars adorned these spiral arms, arranged with perfect order. Zooming into the second spiral arm's outer edge, amidst countless twinkling stars, lay a particular one, the birthplace of the swarm. Surrounding it were a circle of celestial companions, each bearing its own name. At the 11 o'clock position were the bright twin stars of the neighboring star system, at 2 o'clock was the Earth River system, at 3 o'clock, the Black God system, at 5 o'clock, the Red Ant system, near 6 o'clock, the White Grub system, at 8 o'clock, the Golden Horn system, and between 9 and 10 o'clock, the Sandstorm system. The naming conventions reflected Luo Wen's distinctive style, simple, practical, and easy to understand. The Earth River system was named in memory of the underground dark river Luo Wen had traversed over months when he was still the size of a fingernail. The Black God system commemorated the black armored war god. The Red Ant system needed no further explanation, while the White Grub system honored the first creatures to work for Luo Wen. The Golden Horn system was named after one of Luo Wen's favorite insects, a magnificent beetle with a dazzling golden shell. Luo Wen had even planned to adopt a similarly handsome appearance, but for various reasons, the plan was shelved. Despite this, the thought had always lingered in Luo Wen's mind. The Sandstorm system memorialized Luo Wen's first flight, a perilous and thrilling journey. Without his extraordinary origins, he might not have survived. Though trivial in light of his current achievements, it had left an indelible mark on his young heart at the time. Since landing on the Yellow Moon, over 2 centuries had passed since the swarm began their journey into the stars. Although the neighboring star system, being closest to the Genesis system, was prioritized for development and later became embroiled in a conflict with the Rikens due to the discovery of Godzilla, much of the swarm's focus had been drawn there. Nevertheless, the swarm had not abandoned exploration in other directions. Over the years, the swarm had already expanded to all nearby adjacent star systems. However, limited by the number of brood nests and primary bodies at the time, their development was modest. This persisted until the swarm network evolved again, lifting the constraints imposed by the brood nests and primary bodies. Afterward, any node unit could mutate into a brood queen as long as there was sufficient energy. However, Luo Wen had already formed suspicions about the Watchers by then. Therefore, even though expansion was no longer restricted, most of the swarm's forces in these star systems remained hidden beneath the rocky layers of geological planets. This approach continued until 20 years ago, when the Daki intelligent entities appeared, bringing new revelations. These confirmed Luo Wen's hypotheses about the Watcher's identity. With careful consideration, numerous larval and small mature bodies were deployed and transported by the primordial bodies to lie dormant near the inner orbits of nearby stars. Meanwhile, the already formidable space octopuses remained concealed. Although Luo Wen did not have a complete star map, the Daki intelligent entities, particularly those who were formerly captains, provided him with a clearer understanding of their neighboring systems. The swarm's location was considered extremely remote relative to the Interstellar Technological Confederation. Systems such as Earth River and Black God, located behind the Genesis system, were already beyond the Confederation's sphere of influence. Further outward, the systems even fell into unclaimed starfields. However, systems like Sandstorm, Golden Horn, White Grub, and the neighboring Enrican systems were positioned toward the Confederation and bordered territories belonging to other alien races.